Welcome to our deep dive. We're tackling photosynthesis today. We got your textbook chapter notes and a bunch of questions about how plants turn sunlight into food.
Yeah, it's a pretty crucial process.
It is. So we're going to unpack it all, get into the science of it. It's not just about plants making their own food. It's way bigger than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really the basis of life on Earth as we know it.
Right. So maybe let's just start with a simple definition. What is photosynthesis?
Okay, so at its core, photosynthesis is the process where plants, algae, and some bacteria use sunlight to create their own food. They're basically taking light energy and turning it into chemical energy in the form of sugars, primarily glucose.
So like they're making fuel for themselves, basically.
Exactly. And here's the really amazing part. As they do this, they also release oxygen,
The oxygen we breathe.
the very same.
Wow, so it's way more than just plants getting their lunch. It's like the foundation of the entire food chain and even the air we breathe.
Exactly. You know, it's incredible when you think about it. Every breath we take is connected back to this process happening in plants.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And all of this, figuring out how this works, started with some really simple but clever experiments.
Yeah, like that experiment with the candle, the mouse, and the mint plant, right?
Exactly. That was Joseph Priestley. You know, imagine being a scientist way back then. You don't have fancy equipment, but you've got this intense curiosity.
I can imagine.
So Priestley, he noticed that a candle in a sealed jar would eventually burn out. And a mouse put in a similar jar would, well, suffocate.
Makes sense.
But when he put a mint plant in with the candle or the mouse, they'd survive much longer.
Oh, interesting. So he figured out that the plant was doing something to the air.
Exactly. He figured that plants must be putting back something into the air that the candle and the mouse were using up. We now know that something was oxygen.
It's amazing how these simple observations could lead to such a big discovery.
Yeah, they cracked open the door to this whole idea of this vital link between plants and animals.
But plants need sunlight for all of this, right? I remember learning that somewhere.
Absolutely. That's where Jan Inkenhouse's work comes in. He built on Priestley's findings and figured out that this air purification, as they called it, only worked if the plant was exposed to sunlight.
So the sun is like the key ingredient.
It is. He was even able to see oxygen being produced. Ingenhousos was working with an aquatic plant, and he noticed that when it was in bright light, all these tiny bubbles formed around the green parts of the plant.
And those were oxygen bottles.
Precisely. It was a huge leap forward. It really proved how vital sunlight is to the whole process.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And then later on, another scientist, T.W. Engelmann, used bacteria that are attracted to oxygen. And this helped him actually pinpoint where in the plant the oxygen is being produced.
Oh, wow. So like actually mapping it out?
Exactly. He found that these bacteria clustered around the areas of the plant that were illuminated by red and blue light.
So even back then, they were figuring out which colors of light worked best for photosynthesis.
It's amazing what they could accomplish, right?
Yeah.
All that work, all those observations, laid the foundation for us to understand the equation for photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of light yields glucose. That's sugar and oxygen.
It sounds pretty simple when you put it like that.
It does. But of course, there's a lot more happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, I was going to say, it can't be that straightforward, right?
You're absolutely right. It's not just a single step. It's a whole complex chain of events, all happening inside the plant cell, specifically in a special structure called the chloroplast.
Right, the chloroplasts. I remember reading about those.
Think of it like a tiny factory where all the magic happens.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But can you remind me what's going on inside the chloroplast? I remember seeing diagrams with all these stacks of discs. What are those?
Ah, yes. Those are the thylakoids. They're arranged in these neat little piles called grana. They kind of look like stacks of pancakes.
Pancakes. Okay, I can picture that.
And their membranes are super important because that's where the light-dependent reactions take place.
Light-dependent meaning.
Meaning they need light to occur. It's where that light energy gets absorbed and converted into chemical energy. And then there are these other reactions called light-independent reactions. Those happen in the stroma, which is the fluid surrounding the thylakoids.
So we've got the light-dependent reactions in the thylakoids and the light-independent ones in the stroma.
You got it. And despite the name, the light-independent reactions, they don't actually happen in the dark. They just don't directly need light.
Oh, okay, I see.
Think of them more like the assembly line workers who can work day or night, but they need the parts and energy from the light-dependent powerhouse to do their jobs.
That makes more sense.
Good.
So are these reactions where the plant actually creates the sugar?
You're on the right track.
Hmm.
But before we get into that sugar factory, we need to talk about another key player, pigments, those molecules that give plants their green hues.
Right, the pigments. I've always wondered why some plants are like a much deeper green than others. Does that mean they're better at photosynthesis?
That's a great observation. Plants have all sorts of greens because they contain this mix of pigments that absorb light energy. The primary pigment, like the star of the show, is chlorophyll A. That one's responsible for capturing most of the light used in photosynthesis.
Okay.
But it's got this supporting cast.
Yeah.
Chlorophyll B and carotenoids, they have more yellow and orange hues.
So it's like a team effort with different pigments absorbing different wavelengths of light.
Exactly. It's like having a bunch of specialized solar panels, each one capturing a different part of the light spectrum. Remember those scientists who were figuring out that red and blue light worked best for photosynthesis?
Yeah.
Well, that aligns perfectly with the absorption peaks of chlorophyll A.
So it all ties together. But how does absorbing light actually lead to energy? Do the pigments like transform into fuel?
Not quite. The light energy that's absorbed by those pigments is used to energize electrons.
Energized electrons. Oh, hey, now we're getting a bit more complicated.
Don't worry, it's all about energy transfer. To understand how that works, we need to take a closer look at those light-dependent reactions happening in the thylakoid membranes. And that brings us to the photosystems.
Okay, now we're getting to the real action. There are two of them, right? Are they competing? Do they work together? What's going on?
They're definitely more partners than rivals, and their story is one for the next part of our deep dive. We'll unpack how these photosystems kickstart the entire chain reaction that leads to sugar production. Stay tuned.